I watched the fire from my back porch. The wheat was gone in minutes, 300 acres of it, the crop I had spent 7 months growing, the money I had borrowed against to plant, the future I had staked everything on. And the men who lit it were standing at the edge of my field with their arms crossed, watching it burn like they had just done me a favor. What they did not know, what none of them had thought to calculate, was which direction the wind was blowing. I knew. I had farmed that land for 22 years and I had watched that wind every single day, and I knew exactly where it was going. And I said nothing, I just watched. Because sometimes the only thing a farmer needs to do is let nature take its course. Stick around, because what happened next was something none of us will ever forget, and most of them will spend years trying to. Main script, Part 1 ===. My name is Calvin Prout, and I am a third-generation wheat farmer in the Central Plains of this country. My grandfather broke the ground on our property in 1951, 240 acres that he bought with money saved from 12 years of working other people's fields. My father added another 80 acres in 1979, and I bought the adjacent parcel myself in 2003, which brought the total to just over 400 acres of some of the most reliably productive dryland wheat ground in the county. I say this not to brag, but to give you a sense of what this land means to my family, what it represents, and why what happened to it hit the way that it did. Farming is not a career you choose the way you choose to become an accountant or an engineer. It chooses you, or more accurately, it is already in you before you are old enough to make choices. I was riding on the tractor with my father before I started school. I was operating equipment on my own by the time I was 12. I know this land the way I know my own hands, every low spot where water collects after a hard rain, every high ridge where the soil runs thin and needs careful management, the way the afternoon light looks across the field in October when the crop is coming in, and everything you spent the year on is finally visible and real. I have loved this land my entire life. The development went in 8 years ago. The company was called Horizon Premier Estates, which should tell you most of what you need to know about what kind of development it was. They purchased 600 acres on the eastern edge of our township, land that had previously been a combination of failed farmland and scrub pasture belonging to a family named Dobbins who had stopped farming it 15 years prior and had been waiting for someone to buy it. Horizon paid well, the Dobbins family sold, and within 18 months, the bulldozers had turned 600 acres of high plains landscape into something that looked, if you squinted, like a Southern California development had been dropped into the wrong state. There were 42 homes built in the first phase. They were large, most of them over 4,000 square feet, with the kind of architectural details that suggest the designer was working from a magazine rather than from any understanding of the environment. Tile roofs in a region that gets 2 feet of snow some winters. Decorative shutters on windows that nobody ever intended to close. Landscaping that required irrigation in a place where the annual rainfall averages 15 inches and where a drip system running at full capacity in July can consume more water in a week than a working farm uses in a month. They were not houses built for this place. They were houses built for people who wanted to live somewhere that did not look like this place. The homeowners association that governed Horizon Premier Estates was, from everything I observed over the years, exactly what you would expect from a development with that name. It was run by a rotating leadership that consistently prioritized the community's image over anything that might be described as common sense. In my 8 years as their neighbor, I dealt with 4 different HOA presidents, 2 of whom were reasonable people doing an unreasonable job, and 2 of whom were the specific type of person who discovers, in the governance of a homeowners association, an outlet for impulses that polite society had previously kept contained. The president who matters to this story was a man named Gerald Ashworth. Gerald had moved into Horizon Premier Estates in the 4th year of its existence, purchasing one of the larger homes on the development's western edge, which placed him directly adjacent to the fence line separating the development from my property. He was a man in his late 50s who had made money in commercial real estate and had retired to what he described, in the one conversation we had before our relationship soured permanently, as a quieter life. I did not ask him what he thought a quieter life meant in the context of 400 acres of active agricultural operation, because I was trying to be neighborly and I did not yet understand who I was being neighborly toward. Gerald became HOA president 2 years after moving in, elected on a platform that centered on what he called the development's western boundary situation, by which he meant me. The specific complaints he had assembled before his election campaign were threefold. First, the dust. Wheat farming involves tillage, and tillage on a dry plain in the right wind conditions produces dust, and dust travels, and some portion of that dust, apparently, was settling on the pearlescent surfaces of the vehicles parked in the driveways of Horizon Premier Estates. Second, the smell. Fertilizer application, particularly the nitrogen-based products that are standard in dryland wheat production, has a distinct odor that can carry some distance under certain wind conditions. Third, and this was the one that I found the most remarkable, the aesthetics. Gerald had decided and had persuaded a sufficient number of his neighbors that a working wheat field was visually incompatible with the character of a premier residential community. A wheat field, visually incompatible, with a community that had been built 8 years ago on land that had been agricultural for a century. I attended the HOA meeting where Gerald formally presented his boundary concerns, because a neighbor of mine who lived closer to the development had warned me it was coming and suggested my presence might be useful. I sat in the back of the community room in the development's clubhouse, and I listened to a 40-minute presentation about the negative impacts of agricultural operations on residential property values. Gerald had prepared slides. He had graphs showing dust particle counts taken by a company I had never heard of, and smell intensity ratings from a survey of 30 residents, and what he called a visual blight index that assigned a numerical score to views from the development's western side. He had quantified, with the tools of someone who had spent his life in real estate, the fact that his neighbors did not enjoy looking at a farm. When he was done, he looked up from his presentation and said that the HOA was prepared to pursue all available legal remedies to address the situation. He had used the phrase, all available legal remedies, the way people use it when they have not fully investigated what those remedies actually are, which I knew because I had spent time with an attorney named Paul Garrett the previous year after the first round of HOA complaints, and Paul had walked me through the legal landscape with some thoroughness. I was a protected agricultural operation under the state's Right to Farm Act. I had been farming this land for more than 22 years, predating the development by over a decade. The Right to Farm Act existed specifically to protect operations like mine from nuisance complaints by residential developments that had chosen to build adjacent to agricultural land. Gerald's dust complaints, his smell complaints, his visual blight index, none of them had any legal weight against a protected agricultural operation that was operating within standard practices for the region. Paul had told me this clearly. He had also told me that this would not necessarily stop someone determined to make my life difficult, because the law's protection is only as useful as your willingness to defend it, and defending it costs money and time and energy that most farmers would rather spend farming. I told Paul that I had no intention of stopping farming. I had also, quietly and without telling anyone, begun keeping records. Every HOA letter went into a file. Every email, every conversation I had with anyone from the development, I wrote down afterward with the date and the substance. I had been doing this for 14 months before Gerald's presentation. And by the time I sat in that community room, I had a file that was 11 inches thick. Gerald and I did not speak at the meeting. I introduced myself when he opened the floor for questions, stated my name and property address, and asked him to send me the legal citations he was relying on for his various claims. He said his HOA attorney would be in touch. I said I looked forward to it. Then I drove home, called Paul Garrett, and told him to expect correspondence. The correspondence came. It was what Paul had predicted, a letter citing the general nuisance provisions of the state code, which did not apply to my operation under the Right to Farm Act, accompanied by a demand that I implement dust mitigation measures, odor control protocols, and what the letter called visual screening on the western boundary of my property to reduce the aesthetic impact on adjacent residential properties. The visual screening demand was essentially a request that I plant a tree line along 400 acres of fence line at my own expense, so that the people of Horizon Premier Estates did not have to look at the crop that predated their subdivision by 20 years. Paul wrote back. His response was thorough, documented, and legally precise. It cited the Right to Farm statute by section and subsection. It included a summary of my operation's history and tenure. It explained, in language a first-year law student could follow, why every demand in Gerald's letter was without legal merit. It ended with a polite but clear statement that further correspondence along these lines would be retained as evidence of a pattern of harassment against a protected agricultural operation. Gerald's response to this letter was to escalate. What he did next was something I had not anticipated, not because it was creative, but because I had not believed anyone would actually do it. He began filing complaints with the County Agricultural Extension Office, not about anything specific I was doing wrong, but alleging in general terms that my operation was not in compliance with best management practices for agricultural operations adjacent to residential zones. The County Extension Office, which knew me and knew my operation, treated these complaints with the seriousness they deserved, which was approximately none. But each complaint required a response and a record, and Gerald knew that, and he filed 11 of them in 6 months. He also began a campaign within the development. Every HOA newsletter for the better part of a year contained a section about what he called the Western Boundary issue, framed in terms of property values and quality of life, and the development's commitment to its residents. He was building a constituency, creating a community of people who believed they had been wronged by a farmer who had been farming his land for longer than most of them had lived in the state. My neighbors in the farming community watched this with a kind of grim recognition. The pressure campaigns against agricultural operations from new residential developments were not unusual. They happened across the plains states regularly as the edges of towns expanded into agricultural land, and the new residents discovered that farming was not the pastoral backdrop they had imagined when they bought their homes. What made my situation different, and what my farming neighbors pointed out with varying degrees of concern, was that Gerald was more organized and more persistent than most. He was also, I would eventually learn, more willing to cross lines. The fire was not a spontaneous event. I want to be clear about this from the beginning because the subsequent legal and official processes established it with certainty, and I think the circumstances deserve to be stated plainly. On the evening of October 14th, approximately 3 weeks before my wheat was scheduled for harvest, a fire started along the eastern fence line of my property, the side that borders Horizon Premier Estates. It started in 3 separate locations simultaneously. 3 locations, simultaneously, in a field that had received no lightning, that was not adjacent to any power lines, that had no history of spontaneous combustion events, and that happened to be standing wheat in the final weeks before harvest. 3 separate points of ignition, simultaneously, along the fence line between my property and the development where Gerald Ashworth was HOA president. I was in my house when it started. My wife Janet heard it first, or rather smelled it first, that particular heavy sweetness of burning grain that is one of the worst smells a farmer knows. She came into the kitchen where I was eating dinner and said, "Calvin, something is burning." I was outside in 45 seconds. Fire was already moving. October in the Central Plains is dry. The wheat was standing ripe and dry itself, and the evening wind was running southwest to northeast at roughly 12 miles per hour, which any farmer in this region could have told you was a moderate but significant wind for fire movement. I called 911 immediately, and then I called my neighbor Ray Alcott, who farmed the section north of mine and had a tractor with a water tank he used for exactly these situations. Then I looked across the fence line. There were 4 men standing on the development side of the fence. They were watching my field burn, Two of them I did not immediately recognize. One of them was a man named Brett Sauer, who was on the HOA board and who I had seen at the county extension complaints. And one of them was Gerald Ashworth. They were not alarmed. They were watching with the particular stillness of people who are watching something unfold as they expected it to. I stood on my side of the fence, and I looked at them, and they looked at me, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Gerald said something that I wrote down verbatim when I got inside that night, because I knew immediately that it was important. He said, "Calvin, sometimes a field needs to be cleared before something better can grow." I looked at him, I looked at the fire, I looked at the sky. The wind was running southwest to northeast at 12 miles per hour. Gerald's house was northeast of my field. I said nothing. I went back to the house, got my phone, and took video of the four men standing at the fence line with my burning field behind them. I got clear footage of all four faces. Then I called Paul Garrett's emergency line. The county fire department arrived in 14 minutes. Ray Alcott arrived in 11 with his water tank, and together he and the first fire crew managed to establish a containment line along the northern edge of my property before the fire could jump the fence into the county road easement. The field was a total loss. 312 acres of standing wheat, 3 weeks from harvest, gone. The smell of it hung over the land for 2 days. While the fire crews were still working, I walked the fence line with the fire marshal, a man named Dave Ritter, who I had known for years through the County Emergency Management Committee. I showed him the 3 points of ignition I had identified before the crews arrived. I showed him the spacing between them, roughly 80 yards apart along the fence line, consistent with separate deliberate starts. Dave looked at the char patterns. He looked at the spacing. He looked at me. He said he would need to do a full investigation and that I should not disturb anything along the fence line. I told him about the 4 men I had seen. I told him what Gerald had said. I gave him the video on my phone, which he copied to his own device on the spot. I told him I had a file of 14 months of documented harassment and that Paul Garrett would be making it available to any investigating authority that requested it. Dave looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Calvin, I am going to need you to be patient for a little while." I told him I was a farmer. Patience was the only thing I had been trained for. What Dave did not tell me, and what I found out later from Paul, was that the fire marshal's office had already received a complaint about suspicious activity along my fence line 2 evenings prior. A resident from the development had called the non-emergency line to report that they had seen several men with equipment along the fence line after dark and had not been sure whether to call. The dispatcher had logged it as a low-priority property inquiry. It had not been acted on. The resident's name was in the log. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she lived in one of the homes on the development's western edge, 3 houses north of Gerald's. Margaret had been watching, and Margaret, it turned out, had not been entirely comfortable with what she had seen. She called me 4 days after the fire. She said she had already spoken to the fire marshal and had given her statement. But she wanted me to know directly what she had seen and what she had been told was happening. She said she had moved into Horizon Premier Estates 3 years ago because she had wanted space and quiet, and she had not known when she bought her house that the HOA president she was electing was conducting a campaign against the neighboring farmer. She said she had felt uncomfortable about Gerald's newsletter items for a long time, but had not known how to raise it. And she said that on the evening 2 days before the fire, she had seen Gerald and 3 other men carrying what looked like gasoline cans along the fence line, and had heard Gerald say that they were doing a controlled burn to clear some brush on the fence line. There was no brush on the fence line. My fence line was clean, maintained, and had been for 22 years. Margaret had believed him in the moment because he was the HOA president and because people in authority are believed when they offer explanations that sound reasonable even when they are not. She had not believed him by the morning after the fire, when she stood at her window and looked at the charred remains of 312 acres of wheat and understood what the controlled brush clearing had actually been. I thanked her. I told her that her decision to speak up was important and that I was grateful. She said she was sorry it had taken her as long as it did. I told her it had not taken her too long. The timing, as it happened, was exactly right. Because while Margaret had been watching the fence line 2 evenings before the fire, and while Gerald had been explaining himself with calm authority, and while I had been in my house eating dinner and none of us had yet understood what was about to happen, the wind had been blowing southwest to northeast at approximately 10 miles per hour. In the days that followed the fire, I spent a great deal of time on Paul Garrett's phone. The fire marshal's investigation was underway. The county sheriff's office had opened a separate investigation based on the fire marshal's preliminary findings, which had confirmed accelerant at all 3 ignition points. The state agricultural department had been notified because the deliberate destruction of a standing crop was a felony under the state code. There was a great deal of activity, and most of it was moving in a direction that Gerald Ashworth had not planned for when he stood at my fence line watching my wheat burn. But the thing about fire is that it does not wait for legal processes. It moves at the speed of wind and fuel, and on the evening of October 14th, the wind was running northeast at 12 miles per hour, and the fuel, after the 312 acres of wheat were consumed, was the dry scrub and unmaintained vegetation that lined the eastern and northern edges of my property before the land transitioned to the development's manicured lawns and their irrigation-dependent landscaping. The fire crews had established their containment line on the northern fence. They had done their job. The fire in my field was out by 9 that evening. What nobody had fully calculated, including the fire crews in the press of the immediate situation, was the ember cast. In a moderate wind, burning embers from a field fire can travel considerable distances, sometimes a quarter mile or more, carried on the thermal column above the fire. The fire in my field was extinguished. The embers it had cast northeast into the darkness were not. I want to be precise about the timing. The fire in my field was declared contained at 9:14 p.m. The first emergency call from Horizon Premier Estates came in at 9:47 p.m. 33 minutes after my fire was out, a deck fire was reported at a home on the development's western edge. Then another. Then a third. The embers had landed. 3 homes on the western edge of Horizon Premier Estates sustained fire damage that night. One of them was the home of Brett Sauer, who had been standing at my fence line watching my field burn. One of them belonged to a board member named Phil Watts, whose name was on every HOA letter that had come to my address for the past 14 months. And the third one, the one that sustained the most significant damage before the fire crews reached it, was the 4,000-square-foot home on the northwest corner of the development, with the tile roof and the decorative shutters and the pearlescent escalade in the driveway. Gerald Ashworth's house. I was standing on my back porch at 9:47 p.m. when the first light appeared over the fence line to the northeast. I watched the glow build against the October sky, and I thought about a farmer's knowledge of wind, about the 22 years I had spent reading the sky and the grass and the direction of everything, and about the specific evening in October when a man had stood at my fence line and told me that sometimes a field needs to be cleared before something better can grow. The fire departments responded quickly and all 3 homes were saved, though not without significant damage. Nobody was injured. I was glad of that, not as a sentiment, but as a fact that I needed to be true for everything that followed to be what I needed it to be. Because what followed was not just justice. It was a reckoning that had been building for 8 years, and I intended to be present for every moment of it. The morning after the fire, I woke at 4:30, which was my normal time, and I went outside in the dark and I walked my property. I do this every morning regardless of season or weather. It is a practice my father observed and his father before him, a daily accounting of the land, a way of knowing what you are responsible for by the evidence of your own feet on it. That morning, the accounting was different. The eastern fields were black and silent. The smell of burned grain was still heavy in the air, the kind of smell that settles into the landscape and does not fully leave for weeks. I walked the entire eastern fence line, and I looked at what remained of 312 acres of wheat, and I made myself look at it without flinching, because a farmer who cannot look at his worst losses without flinching is not going to survive farming. Then I walked back to the house, made coffee, and called Ray Alcott. Ray was already up. Farmers are. He expressed his condolences in the direct, minimal way that farming people do, which does not mean the sympathy is minimal, only that elaborating on misfortune does not help the misfortune and takes time that could be used for something else. He asked what I needed. I told him I needed a witness to walk the fence line with me that morning and confirm the ignition point locations before the investigation crews arrived, not to disturb anything, just to have another set of eyes with a clear memory of what was where. Ray said he would be there at first light. He arrived at 6:15. We walked the fence line in the early morning light, and Ray, who had been farming this region for 30 years and who had seen fire damage in all its forms, looked at the 3 ignition sites and was quiet for a long time. Then he said what Dave Ritter had not said but had clearly thought. He said, "Calvin, those did not start themselves." I told him I knew. I told him about the 4 men. I told him what Gerald had said. Ray looked across the fence line toward the development, which was quiet in the early morning, and he shook his head slowly with the expression of a man who was not surprised but was nonetheless appalled. Ray had his own history with Horizon Premier Estates. 2 years before my situation developed fully, he had received a series of complaints from the HOA about the smell from his cattle operation, which was a mile north of the development, but downwind from it on certain afternoons. The complaints had gone nowhere legally because of the same right-to-farm protections that covered my operation, but the process of dealing with them had cost Ray both money and patience. He told me that morning on the fence line that he had a file too, that several of the neighboring farmers did, and that if I was going to make a legal case, he wanted to help. I told him the legal case was already in motion and that I would let him know what would be useful. Fire Marshal's investigation moved faster than I had expected. Dave Ritter was thorough and he was experienced, and by the end of the first week, he had a preliminary report that confirmed accelerant use at all 3 ignition points, confirmed the southwest to northeast fire spread consistent with the documented wind conditions, and established that the ignition pattern was inconsistent with any accidental or natural cause. The report did not name suspects. It did not need to at this stage. It established arson as the cause of the fire, which was the foundation that everything else would be built on. Paul Garrett had been busy in parallel. He had filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff citing the evidence I had provided, including the video footage of the 4 men at the fence line, the documented timeline of the HOA harassment campaign, Gerald's statement about the field needing to be cleared, and Margaret Chen's account of the men with the fuel cans 2 evenings prior. The sheriff's office opened a criminal investigation. This was separate from the civil case Paul was building, which was a different kind of structure entirely, and which he was assembling with the patience of a man who had built legal cases for a long time and understood that the foundation needed to be right before anything went on top of it. The civil case had multiple layers. The first was straightforward property damage, 312 acres of standing wheat, 3 weeks from harvest, destroyed by deliberate arson. The value of that crop was calculable and substantial. The second layer was more complex and more significant. The Right to Farm Act, in addition to protecting agricultural operations from nuisance complaints, contained provisions regarding deliberate interference with agricultural operations. Arson of a standing crop was not just criminal destruction of property under the General Criminal Code. It was a specific violation of the agricultural protection statutes with its own enhanced penalties and its own civil remedy provisions. Paul had spent 2 days reading those provisions and had called me on the 3rd day with a tone in his voice I had not heard before. He said, "Calvin, if we can establish who did this, the exposure for them is significant. More significant than they understand." The investigation developed over the following 3 weeks in a way that I can describe as methodical and, in retrospect, inevitable. The county sheriff's investigators are not naive people. They work in a region where they know the landscape, the community dynamics, the history of agricultural disputes. They interviewed all 4 men I had identified from the video. They interviewed Margaret Chen. They pulled phone records under warrant. They found text messages. I did not see the text messages until Paul received the discovery documents months later, but I will summarize what they established. In the 4 days before the fire, there were extensive communications among Gerald, Brett Sauer, Phil Watts, and the fourth man, whose name was Ron Hendricks and who was a member of the HOA's Landscape Committee. The messages discussed what they referred to, with the lack of creativity that tends to characterize people who believe they are being clever, as the Western Boundary solution. They discussed timing, wind conditions, and what Gerald called creating leverage for relocation, by which he meant burning my crop to the point where I would be financially unable to continue farming and would be forced to sell the land. Gerald had done the math, or thought he had. The development's parent company, Horizon Premier LLC, had approached me twice in the previous 3 years about purchasing my property. Both times I had declined. Gerald had apparently concluded that if my farming operation was rendered financially non-viable, I would have no choice but to sell. He had not asked a farmer how long a farmer can operate on nothing before folding. The answer is longer than a real estate developer imagines, because farmers are accustomed to loss in a way that people who have made their lives in commercial real estate are not. A bad year, even a catastrophic year, is part of the calculation. You find a way. You borrow against the land, you plant again, you get back up. Gerald had looked at my balance sheet the way a real estate investor looks at a balance sheet, as a thing that determines behavior rather than the way a farmer looks at a balance sheet, as a condition that needs to be managed. He had also not crucially read the agricultural interference provisions of the Right to Farm Act. Paul had. Paul had read them with great care and had identified a provision that allowed for treble damages in cases where deliberate interference with a protected agricultural operation could be proven, meaning that a court could award me 3 times the actual value of my losses. At the crop value plus equipment disruption, plus the cost of fallowing and replanting and the lost growing season, the actual damages were already in the range of $600,000. Trebled, that was a number that got the attention of anyone who heard it. Paul filed the civil suit in early December. The defendants were Gerald Ashworth, Brett Sauer, Phil Watts, and Ron Hendricks individually, and the HOA as an entity on the separate question of the harassment campaign and the pattern of bad faith legal actions, which had their own cost recovery provisions. The filing was thorough, well-documented, and attached copies of 14 months of the file I had been keeping in my office. The criminal charges came in January. All 4 men were charged with felony arson, felony destruction of agricultural property, and conspiracy. Gerald was additionally charged with a count related to the intimidation of a neighboring property owner, connected to the documented pattern of the harassment campaign. The charges were serious. They were the kind of charges that changed the shape of a person's life. I was not present at the arraignments. I was in my fields preparing for spring planting, which was where I needed to be. Paul called me after each one to report that the defendants had entered not guilty pleas, which was expected and which changed nothing about the weight of the evidence against them. What I was present for was the HOA meeting in February, the one that Janet had to physically stop me from skipping because she said if I did not go I would regret it. She was right. She is usually right about the things I think I want to avoid. The meeting was not called by Gerald. Gerald was, by February, focused entirely on his legal situation and had stepped back from HOA activities with a quietness that was in contrast to every month of his presidency before it. The meeting was called by a woman named Patricia Vaughn, who had been on the board as treasurer for 2 years and who had, in Gerald's absence, been functioning as the de facto operational leader of the association. Patricia was not involved in the fire. She was, as far as I had been able to determine, not aware of it in advance and had been horrified when the investigation's direction became clear. She had retained her own attorney as a precaution and had cooperated fully with the investigators when they came to her with questions about the HOA's activities and finances. Patricia had called the meeting because the HOA was in crisis. The civil suit named the HOA as a defendant on the harassment claims. The HOA's insurance carrier had been notified and had immediately begun reviewing whether the claims fell within coverage, which they did not, because the policy excluded deliberate acts and bad faith legal actions were being characterized as deliberate. The reserves were not sufficient to fund a defense of the scope that was required. The association was facing potential insolvency, and Patricia had called the community together to be honest about it. I sat in the back of the room again, same as I had 18 months earlier when Gerald had presented his visual blight index. The room was fuller this time. People who had never come to HOA meetings were there, people who had bought their houses in a premier development and were now being told that the man they had elected president had potentially exposed them to legal liability through actions they had not authorized and had not known about. Patricia stood at the front of the room, and she was honest. She said the HOA faced a civil suit with serious claims. She said the reserves were inadequate to fund the defense. She said that depending on the outcome of the civil proceeding, members could face a special assessment to cover any judgment or settlement. She said she was sorry, not in the vague political way, but in the direct way of someone who genuinely meant it and understood that meaning it did not change the situation. Then she turned to me and asked if I would like to speak. I had not expected this. Paul had not suggested it, and I had not planned it. But Janet, sitting beside me, put her hand on my arm and said, "Go ahead," and so I went to the front of the room. I did not have a PowerPoint. I did not have a file folder or a legal brief. I stood up there and I told them who I was, which they knew, and I told them what my family had built on that land, which some of them did not fully know. I told them that the land they looked at from their western windows and found visually incompatible with their community's character was land that had been farmed by my family for 72 years. I told them what it meant to watch 312 acres of your work burn on an October evening while 4 men stood at your fence line. And then I said something that I had not planned but that I meant completely. I said that I had no quarrel with them. I had never had a quarrel with them. I had a quarrel with the specific actions of 4 specific people, and those actions were being addressed through the appropriate legal channels. What I wanted from the community, what I had always wanted, was to be able to farm my land in peace, the same peace that my grandfather had when he broke that ground in 1951, before anyone had decided that a wheat field was incompatible with the view from a 4,000-square-foot house. The room was quiet when I finished. Patricia thanked me. I went back to my seat, and Janet took my hand and held it, and I sat there through the rest of the meeting feeling something that I had not felt since October. Not anger, something more like the beginning of relief. The legal processes that followed were lengthy, and I will summarize them because the details of discovery and depositions and motions and countermotions are not the interesting part of this story. The interesting part is the outcome, and the outcome was this. All 4 men pled guilty to criminal charges in a negotiated agreement that avoided trial. Gerald's plea was to a reduced felony with agreed sentencing terms that included a period of incarceration, substantial fines, and a permanent prohibition on holding any office or position of authority in a homeowners association or similar governing body. The other 3 pled to lesser charges with fines and probationary terms. The agreement required full cooperation with the civil process and an admission of liability. The civil case settled in the fall of the following year. The settlement, which was confidential in its specific terms, was described by Paul as fully compensating in a way I will leave you to interpret. The HOA's portion of the settlement was addressed through a combination of their insurance carrier's contribution, negotiated under a reservation of rights after the Libertax exclusion was litigated and partially resolved, and a special assessment against the membership, which was painful and which produced some genuine anger in the development, most of it directed appropriately at Gerald's memory rather than at me. The land was replanted the spring after the fire. I used a portion of the early settlement funds as operating capital, which my bank had agreed to hold pending the resolution, and I put winter wheat in the ground in October of the year following the fire, exactly 1 year after the fields had burned. Ray Alcott helped me plant. He drove the seed drill on the south fields while I ran the north, and we worked through a clear October afternoon that smelled of turned earth and seed and the particular sharpness of fall in the plains. And when we were done, we stood at the fence line and looked at the clean dark rows stretching east toward the sky. Ray said it looked good. I told him it did. Then we went in for coffee. Last time I told you about the night Gerald Ashworth and 3 other men set fire to 312 acres of my standing wheat, watched it burn from my fence line, and then watched the embers carry northeast on the October wind straight into their own neighborhood. Today I am going to tell you what happened when the investigation closed in, when the legal reckoning hit, and what it looked like when 42 households discovered that their HOA president had gambled with their homes and their finances without asking them. Stay with me. Main script part 2 . The weeks between the fire and the first criminal charges were a strange time on the property. Strange in the way that a farming operation is always strange when a field is not what it is supposed to be. I would walk the eastern section in the mornings and the black ground would be there, and the smell and the absence of the crop that should have been standing tall and gold in the October light. Farmers understand absence differently than most people do because we work in cycles, and each part of the cycle has a presence that is felt even when it is not visible. The wheat that should have been there was as real to me in its absence as it had been standing. Janet kept me steady through this period in the way she has for 31 years of marriage, which is mostly by continuing to do the things that need to be done and expecting me to do the same. She managed the financial communications with the bank while I managed the operational side of the property. We had savings and we had equity, and we had a banker named Howard who had known our operation for 12 years and who, when I called him the morning after the fire, said, "Calvin, tell me what you need and we will figure it out." That is the kind of relationship you build with a community banker over decades, and I was grateful for it in a way I had not fully anticipated needing to be. The criminal investigation moved with a thoroughness I respected. The lead investigator was a woman named Detective Sandra Briggs from the county sheriff's office, and she was exactly the kind of investigator you want working a case that you care about, which is the kind who lets the evidence lead and does not get in front of it. She called me twice a week with brief updates that told me the investigation was active without telling me details that might compromise it. I appreciated the professionalism of this. I also appreciated that she had clearly read my 14-month file in its entirety, because when she referenced specific incidents in our conversations, she had the details exactly right. The phone records, which the investigators obtained through a warrant in the 3rd week after the fire, were the turning point that Paul later described as the case becoming fully self-sustaining. The text messages among the 4 men established not just coordination, but premeditation over a period of several days. They established that Gerald had researched wind conditions before choosing the date, which a prosecuting attorney would later describe in court documents as evidence of deliberate planning rather than impulsive action. They established that the purpose, in Gerald's own words in his messages to the others, was to make the Prout situation unresolvable, by which he meant my farming operation financially unviable. What the messages also established, and what Paul found particularly useful for the civil case, was that Gerald had been in communication with a representative of Horizon Premier LLC, the development company, in the months before the fire. The nature of those communications, and what if anything the development company knew or did not know about Gerald's intentions, became a separate thread of the investigation that took considerably longer to resolve and that I will return to. The HOA itself was in a complicated position from the moment the criminal investigation became public, which it did when the local newspaper ran a story in the 3rd week after the fire. The story was factual and restrained, focused on the fire marshal's arson determination and the sheriff's investigation, but it named Gerald and the development, and it was the kind of story that gets read carefully by people with financial stakes in the subject. The development's property management company, which handled the administrative side of the HOA's operations, called Patricia Vaughn within hours of the story's publication. Their concern, expressed with the specific anxiety of people whose business depends on residential developments being perceived positively, was entirely about reputation and liability. Patricia had been trying to manage the HOA's situation with the limited tools available to her. She had no authority to remove Gerald from the presidency because the HOA charter required a community vote for that, but she had been functioning in practice as though she did because Gerald had made himself unavailable to anyone associated with the HOA in the weeks after the fire. He was dealing with his own situation, and the HOA was not his priority, which meant that Patricia was running the operations of an organization whose president was under criminal investigation, while also managing her own legal exposure and trying to maintain the basic functions that 42 households depended on for their common area maintenance and fee collections. I will say something here that I want to be clear about. Patricia Vaughn was not responsible for what happened. She had not known about Gerald's plans. She had not participated in the harassment campaign in any meaningful way. Attending board meetings and processing routine HOA business was not the same as directing bad faith legal complaints against a neighboring farmer. She was a person who had done a volunteer administrative job and had ended up holding the wreckage of someone else's decisions. I did not enjoy watching her navigate that, and when Paul's civil suit was being structured, I specifically asked him to minimize Patricia's personal exposure to the extent that the legal situation permitted. He did. The community meeting in February, which I have described in Part 1, was the moment when the HOA community as a whole understood what they were dealing with. I had watched Patricia organize that meeting with a kind of grim integrity, and I had watched the faces of the 40-some residents in that room as she explained the situation. And what I saw was not the entitled indignation I had expected, but something more like the dawning of a painful comprehension. These were people who had bought houses in a development that had promised them a certain kind of life, and the man they had trusted to maintain the standards of that life had instead spent his tenure conducting a years-long campaign against their neighbor, culminating in an act of arson that had damaged their own homes and exposed them to legal liability they had not signed up for and could not afford to simply absorb. The homes of Gerald, Brett, and Phil had been damaged by the fire, but they had been saved. The damage was real, in one case significant enough to require the occupants to stay elsewhere for several weeks while repairs were made. The insurance claims were filed. The insurance companies, being insurance companies, paid for the fire damage, but flagged the circumstances for further review once the arson investigation became a matter of public record, at which point the question of coverage for losses arising from a fire that the insured party had deliberately set became a very interesting legal question for Gerald and Brett and the others. That process was separate from mine, and Paul handled it only tangentially, but I understood that it was proceeding and that it was not going well for them. The Horizon Premier LLC thread was the last major element to resolve. The communications between Gerald and the development company's representative, as the investigation eventually established, were more limited in their implications than the most concerning interpretation had suggested. Gerald had been in contact with a sales representative, not a legal or executive contact, about the potential availability of my property, and the sales representative had expressed general interest without any knowledge of Gerald's methods or intentions. The development company itself had not directed or encouraged Gerald's actions. This was, in one sense, a relief, because it simplified the legal landscape, but it also meant that Gerald's decision to burn my crop had been, in the final analysis, a freelance operation, something he had done on his own initiative in the belief that it would solve a problem he had decided was his to solve. The criminal plea agreements were reached in the spring, approximately 7 months after the fire. I attended the hearing where Gerald entered his plea. I had debated whether to go. Paul said it was my choice and that there was no legal reason I needed to be there. Janet said I should go if I wanted to, and that if I did not want to, I did not have to justify it. I went because I had spent 22 years farming the land that man had tried to take from me, and I wanted to be present when the legal accounting was made, not for satisfaction, though there was some of that, but for the same reason I walked my fields every morning, to witness, to know what you are responsible for by the evidence of your own presence. Gerald stood in the courtroom and entered his plea in a voice that was quieter than any voice I had heard from him in 2 years of dealing with his letters and his meetings and his presentations. He looked smaller than he had at the fence line in October. People often do in courtrooms when the authority they have been operating under turns out not to extend as far as they believed. The judge accepted the plea. Gerald received a sentence that included a period of incarceration at the county facility, a substantial fine that was directed in part toward a fund for agricultural fire damage recovery, and the permanent prohibition on HOA governance positions that Paul had specifically requested be included as a term. I do not know what Gerald's incarceration was like. I did not follow it. I was planting. The civil settlement was finalized in October, exactly 1 year after the fire. Paul had timed this without telling me, and I found out when he called me on a Thursday afternoon and said, "Calvin, it is done, and I am going to need you to come sign some papers." I drove to his office in town, and I sat across from him, and I read the settlement documents, and I signed where I was asked to sign. And afterward, Paul opened a drawer and produced a bottle of bourbon that I suspect he had been saving for this occasion, and poured 2 glasses, and we sat in his office and drank them without saying very much, which was the right thing to do. The settlement was what it was. I will not give you numbers because the terms were confidential, and because numbers would make this story about money, which it was not entirely. It was about the land and the right to farm it, and the principle that a man who has broken ground and worked soil and fed his family from it for generations should be able to do so without someone deciding that his field is incompatible with their view. That principle had been upheld. The legal system had, in this case, done what it was designed to do. That is not always the outcome, and I know it. I was grateful. The HOA special assessment went out to residents in November. It was not a small number. Several homeowners were visibly upset at the amount, and 2 of them called me personally to express their feelings, which I understood and which I handled with as much equanimity as I could manage, because their frustration was legitimate even if it was misdirected. They were paying for Gerald's decisions. I had also paid for Gerald's decisions, and mine was the greater loss, but I understood that what they were experiencing was real, and I did not dismiss it. Margaret Chen called me in December. She had moved out of the development in September, sold her house at a slight loss, and relocated to a neighborhood on the other side of town where, she said, the HOA newsletters were about events and bake sales and nothing else. She called to ask if the settlement had come through and to tell me she was glad. I told her that her decision to speak up had mattered, that without her account the timeline of the investigation would have been different and the evidentiary picture would have been less complete. She said she wished she had called the authorities on the night she saw the men with the fuel cans rather than waiting. I told her that she had acted with the information she had at the time and that I had no criticism of her. This was true. Ray Alcott organized a planting day the following October, the 2nd October after the fire. He called it what it was, a neighbor helping a neighbor get back on track, and he and 3 other farming families from the surrounding sections showed up on a Saturday morning with equipment and time, and we put the East Fields back in production together. Janet cooked for all of them at noon, and we ate at the long table in the barn, with the October light coming through the open doors and the smell of turned earth coming in from outside. And I thought about 3 generations of my family working this ground, and about what it means to have a community that will show up when you need it to. The development still stands. New families have moved in as others have left in the aftermath of the settlement and the special assessment. The HOA has a new president, a woman named Diane Hooper, who reached out to me in the spring after taking the position and asked if we could meet. We met at the fence line, which I appreciated for its directness, and she told me that the board's intention going forward was to be a good neighbor and asked what that would look like from my perspective. I told her it would look like exactly what it sounded like. No complaints that were not legally grounded, no campaigns about dust or smell or the view from the western side, and no one at my fence line after dark. She said that was reasonable. I said it was. We shook hands, and that was that. I was in the East Field last week, the field that burned, checking the crop that is standing there now, third year back in production. The wheat was at knee height, green and dense, and doing what wheat does in good ground with adequate moisture and sufficient care. I walked the rows for a while, and I thought about Gerald's line, the one he had said at the fence in the October dark, while my field burned behind him. Sometimes a field needs to be cleared before something better can grow. He had meant it as a threat. He had been wrong about almost everything a person can be wrong about when they decide they have the right to clear something that is not theirs. But standing in the East Field with 3 seasons of recovery behind me, I thought that the sentence was not entirely false. Something had been cleared. The antagonism, the legal harassment, the campaign to make my land incompatible with someone else's vision, all of it was gone. What was growing in its place was quieter and more durable, a neighborhood of mostly sensible people living next to a working farm, which is what the situation had always been and all it had ever needed to be. I walked back to the house at the end of that afternoon. The sun was getting low, and the shadows were long across the fields, and everything smelled of earth and grain and October air. Janet was on the back porch with 2 cups of coffee, and she handed me one, and we stood together looking out at the East Fields, and she said, "It looks good."